Hello, and today we'll be talking about etymology of brain anatomy. So to start off, we'll be looking at the sagittal plane. So the word sagittal actually comes from the Latin word sagitta, which means arrow, and sagittal means where the arrow strikes. So looking at the brain from an external view, we can first see the cerebrum. So this is where the cerebrum generally is. So this part of the brain is the cerebrum, and the cerebrum basically means the brain or the understanding in Latin. And moving on, we have the cerebellum. So this part is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum in Latin means a small brain. So as you can see, it is basically a smaller version of what we have as the main brain, which is the cerebrum. This is where it is. Next, we have a few lobes. So the first lobe is the frontal lobe. This is where the frontal lobe is. In general, it is in this area. And the frontal lobe comes from the Latin word frons, which means brow or forehead. Then we've got the parietal lobe, and this is where the parietal lobe is generally at. And parietal lobe comes from the Latin word paries, which means wall. So the parietal lobe is actually forming the walls of the brain. Then we've got the temporal lobe. This is where the temporal lobe is generally at. And the temporal lobe comes from the Latin word tempora, which means the temples. So the temporal lobe is actually just underneath our temples. And then finally, we've got the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe comes from the word ob, which means in back of, and caput, which means head. And that joins together to form the word occiput, which means in the back of the head. So still in the sagittal plane, we are now looking at the internal view. So first we are looking at the cingulate gyrus. This is where it is. And cingulate comes from the word cingulum, which means girdle. So the cingulate gyrus looks like a girdle on top of the corpus callosum. And this is the corpus callosum, and it comes from two words: corpus, which means body, and callus, which means thick or hardened. So the corpus callosum is basically a thick body. Next we have the fornix. This is the fornix, and the fornix just means arch. And then we have the pons. Pons means bridge, and this is the bridge between the brain, which is the cerebrum, and the rest of the spinal cord. Finally, we have the medulla oblongata. This is where it is, and it comes from a few words, which is medulla, which means marrow or inner region, ob, which means towards, and longus, which means long. So the medulla oblongata just means the elongated inner region in the brainstem. Still in the sagittal plane, we are looking at the optic chiasm. This is where it is, and optic comes from the word optos, which means seen, and chiasm comes from chiasma, which means two things placed crosswise. So in Greek, optic chiasm means crossing of the optic nerves, and that is exactly what it is. Then we have the cerebral aqueduct. It is that small duct just where the arrow is pointing. And looking at the word aqueduct, aqua means water, while ducere means to lead. So aqueduct means the water conducting system. Lastly, for the sagittal plane, we have the hypophysis. Hypo in Greek means under, while physis means growth. So hypophysis means undergrowth of the brain, and that is basically the pituitary gland. Yep, so now we come onto the coronal view. Coronal comes from the word corona in Latin, and that just means crown. So looking at the brain from an internal view, we have the lentiform nucleus. So this is where the lentiform nucleus is. So here it is. And lentiform means lens or lentil shaped, while nucleus, which means inner part, comes from the word nux, which means nut. So joined together, lentiform nucleus just means the lentil shaped inner part. And then next we have the putamen. The putamen, as you can see, is part of the lentiform nucleus, and it means shell. So it is basically the shell, the outside of the lentiform nucleus. And moving on, we have the globus pallidus. So as you can see again, globus pallidus is part of the lentiform nucleus, and it comes from the word globus, which means globe or sphere, paleo, which means pale or grey, and idus, which means enlargement. So globus pallidus just means large, pale globe. So next we have the insula. So insula just means island or in isolation, and this is where the insula is. So the insula is a small region of cortex hidden deep within the lateral sulcus. It looks as if it is in isolation from the rest of the cortex, even though it is not. Then we have the subthalamic nucleus. This is where it is. And subthalamic comes from the word sub, which means under, and it basically means that it's under the thalamus. I'll be talking about the thalamus in a later slide. And then we have the substantia nigra. So this is the substantia nigra, and substantia just means being or material or substance, and nigra means black. So combined, substantia nigra just means black substance. And finally, we have the hippocampus. So the hippocampus means seahorse in Greek, which is coming from the words hippos, which means horse, and campos, which means sea monster. So finally, we're looking at the transverse plane. So transverse comes from the word transverter, which means turned or directed across. And that comes from two words, which is trans, that means across, and verter, which means to turn. So looking at the external view, we can first see two hemispheres. So hemisphere just means half a sphere, and that comes from two words, which is hemi, that means half, and sphaira, which means sphere. So moving on, we can see some gyri. For a singular term, that means gyrus. And gyrus just means circuit. So this is an example of a gyrus. And gyri are convolutions or twists and turns between the grooves of the brain. Then we can see some sulcus or sulci, and sulcus just means wrinkle. So this is an example of a sulcus, and it is basically the indentation of the brain in between two gyri. And now we're looking at the longitudinal fissure. This big dash down the middle is the longitudinal fissure, and it comes from the word findere, which means to split. So the longitudinal fissure is basically the big dash down the middle that splits the brain into two hemispheres. Looking on the inside, we have again the corpus callosum, which I mentioned just now. The septum pellucidum, that is this structure in the middle, and it comes from the words sepus, which means hedge or partition, and per, which means through, lucere, which means to shine, so pellucided means transparent, and that combined becomes a transparent membrane separating the two lateral ventricles. And then we have the caudate nucleus. So this is where the caudate nucleus is. Cauda just means tail. So the caudate nucleus is just a tail-shaped basal ganglia. Then we have the putamen again, globus pallidus, and we have the thalamus, which I didn't mention just now. And thalamus just means inner chamber. So it's right in the middle of the brain. And this is part of the fornix. And these are my references. Thank you for listening.